Good morning, everybody. I am pleased to call this subcommittee meeting on conservation, climate, forestry, and natural resources to order. And I'm also grateful to Ranking Member Marshall for his partnership in organizing today's hearing on Western water resilience. I know he shares my concern about the unprecedented drought the West faces, especially as it relates to the declining water levels in the Ogallala aquifer. Our purpose this morning is simple: to sound the alarm about the water crisis in the American West. The West has not been this dry in 1,200 years. 1,200 years. And if we don't get our act together here, it's going to not only put our Western agriculture at risk, but the American West as we know it. My state sits at the headwaters of the Colorado River, which starts as snowmelt in the Rockies before cutting across 1,400 miles to the Sea of Cortez. The Colorado River Basin is the lifeblood of the American Southwest. It provides the drinking water for 40 million people across 7 states and 30 tribes. It irrigates 5 million acres of agricultural land. It underpins the West's $26 billion outdoor recreation and tourism economy, and it is running out of water. The 2 largest reservoirs in the basin, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, are at the lowest levels they've been in since they were filled over 50 years ago. Lake Powell has dropped more than 30 feet just in the last few years. The water crisis is not limited to the Colorado River Basin. The most recent data from the U.S. Drought Monitor found that more than 50% of the entire contiguous United States is experiencing severe drought. And right now, more than 75% of the western region is seeing severe drought. These conditions threaten to put farmers and ranchers out of business, threaten the communities that rely on water to support their families and their livelihoods, which is every community in the West, and frankly, threatens our way of life in the West. Farmers like Joel Draken, a dryland wheat farmer near Akron, Colorado, he told me he's had to tear up 400 acres, nearly a third of his land, because there wasn't enough water. He's also had to sell 1/10 of his herd because there's not enough grass to graze his cattle. Paul Bruchet is a rancher in Grand County, Colorado. He remembers when water from the Colorado used to flow 6,000 cubic feet per second. Today, he said they're lucky to have 1,000 cubic feet per second. Harrison Top, a fruit grower from the North Fork Valley, told me he's lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in the last 3 years from drought. There is no longer even a slim margin for error in our production practices, he said. A farmer in the same county, James Henderson, said it used to take 1 hour to irrigate his soil. Now it takes 6 hours because the ground is so parched. And the main reason for all of this is climate change. Rising temperatures means less snowpack in the Rockies, which means less runoff to feed our rivers, and that means less water for farmers, for ranchers, and communities across the West. And on top of that, the rising temperatures mean that whatever water makes it into our rivers evaporates and gets absorbed into the ground more quickly because it's so dry. This is a 5-alarm fire in the American West. When hurricanes and other natural disasters strike the East Coast or the Gulf states, Washington springs into action to protect those communities. That's what a federal government is supposed to do, to bring the full power and resources of the American people together to help our fellow citizens. But we haven't seen anything like that kind of response to the Western water crisis, even though its consequences, I would argue, are far more wide-reaching and sustained than any other natural disaster. And that's just water. I haven't even mentioned how climate change is incinerating our forests and blanketing our communities in smoke from wildfires. 3 of the largest wildfires in Colorado's history were all in 2020. The day before New Year's Eve, the Marshall Fire destroyed over 1,000 homes in Boulder County, Colorado in 24 hours. It was sheer devastation. Last year, communities in my state had some of the worst air quality in the world because of wildfire smoke. I'm sad to say this, but northern Utah and Colorado on the same day had the worst air quality in the world, worse than Beijing, and that led Senator Romney and me to take a raft trip in Moab to talk about water and climate and forestry. which I deeply appreciated. There are days when people can't go outside. They can't open their windows. They can't see the mountains. The dangerous air pollution puts Coloradans' health at risk, and it's left people across the West to reckon with a sobering possibility, a future where this isn't the exception, but the norm. I deeply worry that if we don't act urgently on climate, it will make the American West unrecognizable to our kids and to our grandkids, and I refuse to accept that. And the people of my state refuse to accept that. They have a reasonable expectation that our national government is going to partner with them and help protect the American West. So my hope is that our hearing today will help shake the complacency in Washington and create the momentum we need to act urgently. And I'd like to thank the witnesses who are here today for sharing their expertise in this area. I look forward to hearing about what they're seeing and experiencing on the ground and the ways they are trying to manage the crisis. We need to act now to bring immediate relief to these Western communities, and we simply can't address the Western water crisis in any meaningful way unless we come together in a partnership. To underscore the crisis at hand, I have a map of the current U.S. drought monitor. Senator Marshall's staff has brought it in testimony from the Colorado Water Congress, the Family Farm Alliance, the Colorado Association of Wheat Growers, Trout Unlimited, and a rancher in Grant County, Colorado, describing the situation we face in the American West. I ask unanimous consent that they be entered into the record. So moved. That was fun to do. Thank you. I'd like to also say thank you to Senator Bozeman, the ranking member of the Agriculture Committee, for being here. It means a lot that you would be here, especially coming from Arkansas, a place where they don't quite have the same drought conditions that we have, and it's too much water, not too little. But let me turn it over now to my ranking member, the distinguished senator from Kansas. Thank you, Senator Marshall.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. I want to thank our subcommittee chairman, Bennett, and his staff and my staff for holding today's hearing and all the work they've done. I want to thank all the witnesses sincerely for making the trip out here, taking several days out of your daily life as well. And again, I'm honored, of course, to have our ranking member, Bozeman, and all my colleagues here, Senator Tuberville, for coming as well. We appreciate that. It's been almost a decade since drought was a key focus on the Ag Committee hearing, and I'm hoping we can gain some real insight today on how to address the challenges we're facing out west with regards to drought, wildfires, and conservation. Senator Bennett, the western third of Kansas, the eastern third of Colorado look a lot alike these days, and they always have. And you mentioned the Colorado River, but the Arkansas River is very important to us. Now, the Arkansas River is spelled like Arkansas, but we pronounce it Arkansas River as it goes out of Colorado through Kansas. I'm not sure what the Okies call it. They call it Arkansas. I thought they might. But I've enjoyed fly fishing in the headwaters of the Arkansas River. The mayfly hatchery up there is incredible, but much of the riverbed is dry. My wife is from Arkansas, and her grandfather told me a story of coming to Colorado when he was a lawyer, a railroad lawyer of some kind, coming to Colorado and having the Arkansas River between his legs at the headwaters. He just couldn't believe it, because by the time it got to Arkansas, obviously it was much, much wider than that. But unfortunately, through much of Kansas, it's literally a four-wheeler trail ride for us. In 1935, after surveying the aftermath of the worst dust storm ever recorded in North America, Robert Geiger was an Associated Press reporter from Washington, D.C. He summed up the life in our region with the quote from him, 3 little words achingly familiar on a Western farmer's tongue: rural life in the Dust Bowl of the continent, if it rains. If it rains. This is not new, but it's certainly exacerbated. Even today, these 3 words dictate entire livelihoods on the high plains, especially in our home state of Kansas and Colorado. Just last month, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration deemed April as one of the driest months on the record in the last 100 years. Currently, over half of Kansas is designated moderate drought, and over a third of the state is designated as severe, again, as the chairman commented already. So much of Kansas and Colorado in those extreme drought conditions. Just last week, the Topeka Capital Journal reported that the projected wheat yield in Kansas is expected to drop by over 100 million bushels. I think that's about 30% of our average yield is going to be impacted by drought this year. That's a value of over $1 billion to the state of Kansas. This lack of rain not only hurts farm production at its most crucial time, but it also adversely affects ranchers and families who fall victim to raging wildfires. And yes, we've had horrible prairie fires the past several years. This lack of rain hurts farm production at its most crucial time, but it adversely affects farmers and ranchers who fall victim to raging wildfires across the plains, incurring hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars lost in assets, and at the worst, the lives of homes and the personal lives, as well as genetics of cattle they'll never be able to replace. Many of our friends in the private sector and our region's universities have been working on solutions in drought resiliency and fire mitigation, and I'm excited to hear from them. I hope this hearing will yield positive results for the future of the Western United States. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Marshall. I appreciate that, and it's nice to have a neighbor, actually, as the ranking member, because we have a lot in common. Senator Bozeman, do you have anything that you'd like to? Okay. So I'm now going to introduce the three witnesses that I invited to testify at today's hearing, and then Senator Marshall will introduce his two from the Arkansas River Valley. These are all leading experts in their fields with decades of experience in the sustainable management of our water, from snowpack to forest, streams, and wetlands. All of them have spent years partnering with diverse groups across the West to manage our water resources in a way that preserves our economy and way of life for the next generation. Our first witness, Mr. Andrew Mueller, is a longtime leader in Western water issues with extensive policy, legal, and technical expertise. He currently serves as general manager of the Colorado River Water Conservation District, headquartered in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. The River District leads the protection, conservation, and management of the Colorado River for 15 western Colorado counties, along with the broader use of the river water in my state. The Colorado River District has led efforts to protect critical water flows to sustain agriculture and protect 4 endangered fish species in the Colorado's upper basin. Before leading the River District, Andy spent 23 years practicing law in Ridgway, Colorado, where he specialized in water, natural resources, and land use issues. Andy earned his law degree from the University of Colorado and his BA in history from Kenyon College in Ohio. Mr. Mueller, thank you for your leadership in our state, and thanks for being here. Dr. Courtney Schultz is a leading expert at the intersection of forestry, social science, and policy, who has also authored over 50 publications on U.S. forest policy issues, along with a book on the collaborative forest landscape restoration program at USDA. Dr. Schultz currently serves as a professor of forest and natural resource policy at Colorado State University in Boulder, where her research focuses on landscape restoration, fire management, and adapting to climate change on U.S. forest lands. Dr. Schultz also serves as the director of the Public Lands Policy Group, which produces research to strengthen natural resource management and policy related to our public lands. Dr. Schultz also started the CSU Climate Adaptation Partnership, which connects scientists, resource managers, and policymakers to work collaboratively to help the American West adapt to climate change. Dr. Schultz holds a BA from Stanford and an MS in conservation biology and sustainable development from the University of Maryland, and a PhD in forestry at the University of Montana. Thank you for being here, Dr. Schultz. The last witness I will introduce is Dr. Ellen Herbert, a senior scientist at Ducks Unlimited. As members of this subcommittee know well, Ducks Unlimited is a leading advocacy group of sportsmen and women committed to conserving America's wetlands. To date, the organization has conserved over 15 million acres of waterfowl habitat, and its leadership has supported the protection of another 177 million acres of wetland nationwide. Dr. Herbert is a member of Duck Unlimited's national and international science team, where she evaluates the outcomes of their conservation work through field experimentation, numerical modeling, and data synthesis. Before joining Ducks Unlimited, Dr. Herbert completed field research on the effect of drought and sea level changes in the San Francisco Bay and coastal Georgia. Dr. Herbert earned a BA in biology from, guess where, Kenyon College, and a PhD in environmental science from Indiana University, where she was also a graduate research fellow for the National Science Foundation. Dr. Herbert and Dr. Schultz and Mr. Mueller, I cannot thank you enough for your leadership on these issues and for making the trip for today's hearing. I look forward to your testimony. I hope it'll give our Senate colleagues a better appreciation for the specific, immediate, and growing danger climate change poses to the American West. Thank you, and I now recognize Ranking Member Marshall, who will introduce our next two witnesses.
All right, Chairman Bennett, I'm pleased to introduce two panelists today hailing from Kansas, Mr. Earl Lewis and Mr. Tom Willis. In full disclosure, these gentlemen are both good friends I've known for decades. They live, eat, and sleep conservation, and I appreciate both of them being here today. Earl Lewis is, of course, the Chief Engineer of the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources and a member of the Western State Water Council. He's dedicated his career to water resources in Kansas, and his role, he's responsible for any laws in the states which are related to water conservation, management, and control. In addition to his role as Chief Engineer, Earl has served on the Governor's Water Vision team, developing the long-term vision for the future of water supply in Kansas, and is on multiple councils and boards related to water policy and conservation. Now, Tom Willis, he is a titan of agriculture. He's an entrepreneur, a businessman, and again, a lifelong conservationist before it was in vogue. He has many ventures, but one of them is the owner of T&O Farms just south of Garden City, Kansas, where he tries to grow crops on about 6 or 8 inches of rain every year. Tom was the first to establish a water technology farm in the state of Kansas in partnership with the Kansas Water Office. Since 2016, Tom and his son, a veteran, have been studying and implementing new technologies such as soil moisture probes, drip irrigation, and aerial photography to manage irrigation methods on their operation. As we continue discussing solutions for water management and usage, I'm confident that the perspectives of these two Kansans will provide beneficial to the committee. And one final shout out, I want to shout out to Dr. Herbert and DU. You've been a lifelong partner for my family. You've been one of our choices for charitable contributions. We've helped establish hundreds of water habitat for ducks on our personal property. Your work has not gone unnoticed. No one does a better job of taking the monies you're giving them and establishing habitat, which we all get to enjoy, and we appreciate DU being here and represented. I think that's a great choice on your part, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. You're certainly right, and appreciate that, Senator Marshall. Okay, so to the witnesses who actually know what they're talking about, we're very happy that you're here. Please try to keep your testimony about 5 minutes each, and any written testimony beyond that we'll certainly include in the record. Mr. Mueller, you may proceed with your testimony, and we'll go right down the line. Thank you.
Chairman Bennett, Ranking Member Marshall, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the crisis that I am seeing play out before my eyes in western Colorado. My name is Andy Mueller. I'm the General Manager of the Colorado River Water Conservation District. As a regional government, we lead in the conservation, development, and protection of the headwaters of the Colorado River in a 15-county area in western Colorado. The precipitation in our district alone provides 65% of the Colorado River's annual average flow. We are at the headwaters of a river system that supports 40 million people, 5 million irrigated acres of agriculture, 2 countries, 30 sovereign tribal nations, and 7 states, and 11 national parks. We're the first link in an immense chain vital to the health and future of the single most important natural resource in the American Southwest. The Colorado River is aptly referred to as the hardest working river in America. Maybe the folks from Arkansas would disagree with us, but even in wet years, the river no longer reaches its natural mouth of the Sea of Cortez, and claims to water exceed its annual average flow every year. The massive system of federal reservoirs on the Colorado River was designed and built to accommodate the known natural variability in the river system and worked extremely well for over 50 years. However, the longest and most severe drought on record, that once highly functioning federal system is dangerously depleted, with only 34% of system storage remaining, forcing the Department of Interior and the Basin states last year and this year to resort to emergency actions to keep the system from collapse. Over the last 22 years, the flows of the Colorado River have been 20% below average, and sound science tells us we should anticipate and plan for significant reduction in flow in the future. The climate we have experienced in the last 20 years, as Senator Bennett alluded to, has been hotter and drier than any period in the last 1,200 years. There is a direct causal relationship between rising temperatures and the volume of water flowing in the Colorado River and its tributaries. Western Colorado, the most significant regional source of water in the Colorado River, is an epicenter for significantly above average rise in temperatures. Most of our 15 counties have experienced a more than 4-degree Fahrenheit rise in temperatures since 1895, with greatly accelerating temperatures over the last decade, a very concerning trend for those of us in the basin. For every 1 degree Fahrenheit rise in average temperature, we see stream flow reductions between 3 and 9%. None have felt these climate impacts more than our family-owned farms and ranches in our Colorado River District. The plentiful water resources of the past are no longer physically or legally available for many of our ag producers. Families who have been involved in ranching for multiple generations are being forced to sell their cattle and confront tremendously uncertain futures. This drought is threatening our local, regional, and national food supply. We cannot, nor will we, throw up our hands and surrender the thriving American Southwest to the forces of climate change. Citizens, communities, and governments throughout the Southwest are developing strategies, but as in the past, when our nation has been confronted by existential threats, we need the federal government to be an integral partner in our efforts. We must recognize that there is no single solution which will allow us to escape this rapidly changing climate. It is a multifaceted effort. I want to touch on a few concrete examples which are worthy of your consideration. We need additional strategically placed small reservoirs in our high mountain valleys. These will help us successfully mitigate climate change by retiming the flows, which will provide essential water for our streams, our community, and our food supply. Federal assistance through funding tools like PL 566, the Watershed Act, will be essential to our effort to adapt and retime this water. We need more robust agricultural efficiency projects, such as the Lower Gunnison project in my district, where agricultural producers team up with local, regional, state, and federal government agencies to adapt to climate change. Through an expanded and streamlined RCPP program, we can help producers and stream quality in many other watersheds in the American West. The high mountain snowpack is the greatest reservoir in the Colorado River, and our water users and for our water users on the western slope of Colorado. The 2023 Farm Bill presents opportunities to encourage public investment in proper forest management, forested natural water infrastructure, enhancing climate resilience of water supplies, and supporting workforce development and increasing the pace and scale of watershed restoration and adaptation. The multi-decadal drought and conclusive climate science clearly demonstrate that our demands greatly outstrip the water supply in the Colorado River Basin. To survive and continue to thrive in the Southwest, we will need to implement an all-hands-on-deck approach, and every water user sector, from agriculture, industry, to municipal water users, will have to meaningfully reduce their water consumption. If Congress is to incentivize the reduction of irrigated ag in the Colorado River Basin, any such program must support productive agriculture while focusing incentives on following hobby farms and marginally productive lands. The federal government should not fund the retirement of productive agricultural lands. In conclusion, we're only beginning to see this climate crisis in the American West. We cannot afford to remain idle as rivers and reservoirs dry and families shutter their business. Wishing for snow and rain is no longer an adequate plan at any level of decision making. If our communities are going to survive in Colorado and downstream, decisive action at the federal level is needed to help us adapt to this hotter and drier future. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller.
Thank you.
Very much appreciated. Mr. Lewis, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Marshall, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to talk about this very critical issue. My name is Earl Lewis. I'm the Chief Engineer of the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources and a member of the Western States Water Council, who I appear on behalf of today. The Western States Water Council is a member organization representing the 18 Western states, and members are appointed by and advise each of the governors. As each of the people that have talked before me have mentioned, the situation in the West is dire. We have heard about the Colorado River Basin and the 40 million people and 5 million acres that are challenged with low water supply. The situation in the Great Plains is similar in the fact that over time we are receiving less precipitation and are challenged by drought. Each year when we have less precipitation, that means that our farmers are pumping more water, exacerbating the declines in the Ogallala Aquifer. This is a vital resource for our region, and if we don't act, we'll end up with a situation with that resource going away, as well as the agricultural production that's associated with that irrigation. There are 3 roles that I believe the federal government plays when it comes to drought. First, operation of federal infrastructure, particularly with the Bureau of Reclamation and Corps of Engineers. Second, collection, analysis, and distribution of data to all levels of government and individual producers. And third, cost share programs to producers and communities that help to mitigate drought and its effects. The collection, analysis, and open sharing of reliable data is important for water availability for all levels of government. I'd like to touch on a few of those that deal with the federal government. The National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, is a multi-agency partnership that coordinates drought monitoring, planning, and forecasting, including the drought monitor, which we talked about here today. The Western States Water Council supports NIDIS and co-chairs its executive council with USDA and NOAA. Senator Thune has been a champion of NIDIS and drought monitoring improvements, and we thank him for his past support. In much of the West, winter snowpack and spring runoff dominate stream flow and water supply. USDA's Snow Survey and Water Supply Forecasting Program and SNOTEL within NRCS is critical for water users, managers, and planners. Program funding has been flat at about $9 million per year over the last 2 decades, while equipment, staffing, and other costs have increased, challenging the program to meet staffing levels and to maintain an adequate network. An anticipated 50% increase in the President's 23 budget has not been realized, although we would encourage your consideration of this request. The Western States Water Council also supports robust programmatic funding for improved seasonal to subseasonal precipitation forecasting, often known as S2S. It is critical to improve lead time for water supply planning, as well as reservoir and agricultural operations. Pilot programs have been proposed to improve NOAA's 90-day precipitation forecast, but funding has been inadequate to date. Water resource managers and agricultural interests are reliant on evapotranspiration data, or ET data, for irrigation scheduling, management, water right administration, and a host of other issues. Satellite-based ET data is already available in some regions, but it is often not readily reliable for modeling and decision-making at the watershed or field scale. The Council supports legislative proposals for an open ET program that fills the urgent need for an operational system that can produce accurate consumptive crop water use estimates, such as Senate 2568, introduced by Senator Cortez Masto. We encourage the subcommittee to consider USDA's role and resources needed to participate in building a national water data network, as well as partnerships to advance the use of water information to serve the needs of agriculture. Senator Lujan, together with Senator Heinrich, have introduced legislation to establish a national water data framework. Western States Water Council welcomes the introduction of the Water Data Act and supports coordination and leverage of state and federal resources. Finally, USDA conservation assistance programs help agricultural industry thrive in good times and survive in hard times. The Council supports collaborative, targeted, and voluntary programs promoting conservation practices and groundwater recharge to preserve long-term ground and surface water resources. Programs such as EQIP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program are all programs which implement best management practices on the ground to lessen the need for water and help mitigate drought. Likewise, the USDA's Rural Development Agency helps rural communities plan and implement projects to have a reliable water supply. Planning for and limiting the impact of drought will take all levels of government working together, which is why I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you for that opportunity, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We appreciate your being here today, and thank you for your testimony. Dr. Schultz.
Thank you, Chairman Bennett, Ranking Member Marshall, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. My name's Courtney Schultz. I'm a professor of forest and natural resource policy at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I also lead our university's climate adaptation partnership. In Colorado and across the country, climate change is leading to increased fire, smoke, flooding, and drought. In April of this year, USDA designated the entire state as a primary natural disaster area due to severe drought conditions that are likely to persist for years. Drought is projected to cost the state more than $500 million in annual agricultural damages by 2050, and reduced water availability will affect municipal and agricultural water users alike. Fire is also increasing in Colorado and across the West. 3 of the state's largest wildfires in history occurred in 2020 alone, and the state witnessed its costliest fire in state history in December, which is supposed to be winter, the Marshall Fire, which burned 6,000 acres and over 1,000 homes in a suburban setting last year. When fires are followed by heavy rains, which will only become more likely, we will see landslides, millions of dollars in damage to water infrastructure, and flash floods that lead to the loss of life and property. In some places, forests are also not growing back, and smoke from fires is increasing with major implications for human health. These impacts fall disproportionately on low-income and marginalized populations in our state and beyond. And as a headwaters state for vital rivers that supply 18 other U.S. states and Mexico, drought and fire have impacts that extend well beyond our state borders. At CSU, our land-grant university, we are undertaking extensive work related to climate change. We are truly at the forefront of research on fire, researching resilience of the built environment to natural disasters like fire, climate adaptation strategies in forest and rangelands, post-fire issues in Colorado and across the West with a focus on rural and indigenous communities, examining wildfire impacts on forests, snowpack, stream flow, and sediment yield. And we collaborate with USDA extensively on these efforts and appreciate the partnership with the agency's research arms. Others at our university are working on climate-smart agriculture, soil-based climate solutions, sustainable livestock systems, and agrivoltaics innovation. We're home to the Partnership on Air Quality, Climate, and Health, whose members are studying smoke and, importantly, smoke communication to protect human health. We are also growing partnerships with USDA Climate Hubs related to drought and adaptation planning, and these are core activities of our extension efforts at CSU. And we're developing educational opportunities that would serve the existing workforce, train new graduate students, and train and recruit youth into these fields. I want to highlight a few potential areas for future attention and investment. We see potential for augmenting funding for climate adaptation research and possibly for more land-grant USDA Climate Hub partnerships, perhaps with multi-year funding to support partnerships for agriculture and forest resilience. There also may be value in exploring authorizing the climate hubs. A recent 5-year review of the hubs indicated that there's significant demand for their work and a lot of areas for growth. For forest and fire management, which is my area of expertise, the situation will only get worse, and it's far more expensive to respond reactively than it is to work proactively. Thinning and reintroducing beneficial fire in forests can reduce fire hazard near communities. It can give firefighters greater opportunities to engage fire as it moves towards the interface where people live, and can serve to reduce fire intensity, which can protect the forest ecosystem for the benefits it provides, including water provisioning and carbon storage. At the same time, the best way to protect communities is to work on defensible space and fuel reduction right around homes because embers can come from miles away. And most ignitions are actually human-started on private land. So if we're trying to protect communities, work needs to be done across jurisdictions with strong community-based partner engagement. Partners have noticed that forest management in high-priority areas would require a $40 to $60 billion investment across jurisdictions in the next 10 years and must rely on federal, state, tribal, NGO, and private partnerships to accelerate action. We got partway there in the infrastructure bill, and I would encourage you to continue seeking the necessary funding with a few recommendations. Partners are seeking greater involvement, transparency, and accountability for how these funds are being spent to ensure they're going to the intended purpose, being placed strategically, utilizing community-based partnerships, promoting carbon storage, and going to areas that have been historically underserved. I would recommend a clear plan specifically for the funding in the infrastructure bill that is dedicated to prescribed fire, which is an essential forest management tool, and a transparent discussion of how to deploy funds where they're needed most, given current workforce shortages and limited industry capacity to do restoration work. I'd also be happy to work with you on how future investments can be guided through improved performance measures that focus on outcomes, such as more emphasis on the acres mitigated target with strong external oversight and engagement. In light of the impacts of a changing climate, the challenge of managing our connected forests, watersheds, and farmlands is monumental in Colorado and across the West. My colleagues and I are ready to assist in this endeavor and greatly appreciate the opportunity to discuss these issues with the committee today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schultz, and we will take you up on your offer of assistance. Mr. Willis, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Chairman Bennett, Ranking Member Marshall, and members of this subcommittee for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Tom Willis, and Senator Marshall, we're not in Kansas anymore. You guys can read my testimony. There's 3 or 4 points that I'd like to make in the allotted time that I've got. Number one, this drought is real. Easiest way I can signify that, we have not had measurable participation on my farm, and I farm in 4 counties in western Kansas since last August. This morning at 3 o'clock in the morning, I got a call from my wife. Usually when that happens, it means I've got cows out on the highway and my cowboy's drunk somewhere. That's not why she called. She called to tell me that it was raining. We got 1.2 inches last night. That's the first rain we've had since last August. Number two, when that happens in our area, because of the harshness of the climate, we pull heavy on the aquifer. When I first bought my farm, and we farm, my son and I farm about 7,500 irrigated acres in Kansas, southwest Kansas. When I first bought it, after the first year, my pull down on my average wells from that farm was 10 feet. That's 10 feet of water that we used out of the aquifer that was not replenished. And I could see that that was not sustainable. So, working with the state, we developed one of the first water tech farms. And in that was to say, how can we be profitable and still conserve water? So, working with the state, we put in changed nozzle packages on our sprinklers. We redid our sprinklers. We put moisture probes in because the average farmer will look at his, everything he sees is above ground. By using moisture probes, we were able to go down as far as 5 feet and say, really, what does the water look like down there? How much water does it actually need? We also used telemetry. Telemetry allows me to look at the well when it's running, and if I get tempted to turn it up a little faster, I can actually see what it does to the aquifer in that particular well. And most of the time, it's enough to make you kind of slow it back down. That's been helpful. We've used remotes on all of our circles. Why is that important? In the past, when a pivot broke down, you might not know about it for 4, 5, 6 hours. It would stand in one place and sprinkle the same place. We're able to know instantaneously. And my sons and our hired men are really good at turning sprinklers off at 3 o'clock in the morning so that we don't waste water. We changed our crop rotation. When I got there, it was corn, soybeans, soybeans, corn. We've implemented sorghum. And as a disclaimer, I am on the National Sorghum Producers, but I will tell you that sorghum is the resource-conserving crop, and it is suited very well for southwest Kansas. It's hardy, and it can be made to be profitable, because that was our goal. All of that combined, I guess to get right to the bottom line on it, we've saved, in 6 years, we've saved 8,887 acre feet, or to put that in terms of gallons, that's 1.2 billion gallons of water that we've saved. By changing rotation, by using the technologies that are out there, that's real water. And that will be there for my son, for my grandson, and for the way of life that we chose to live. So, very happy with that. I do utilize state programs. I get asked sometimes, why don't you use the federal programs? The reality of it is this: the state is simple. They'll cost share a water probe with me, they'll cost share a meter with me, they'll cost share telemetry with me. Depending on what the year brings, I can be very flexible. Unfortunately, with the federal programs, they mean well, but their flexibility is not there. So I can't afford that, given the ever-changing climate and what I have to deal with from an environment perspective. I have to have maximum flexibility. So One of the asks that I would have is that we construct this new farm bill. If we put anything in there, remember, one size does not fit all. And the key to getting farmer adaptation to all this is flexibility. The other thing you have to look at is risk. In today's margins, farm margins with input costs where they are, it's hard to get a farmer to think outside what has worked for him because he doesn't want to lose his farm. So incentivizing that change would be good. So anyway, I'm out of time, but I want to appreciate you listening to me. But I want to tell you this problem is real. It cannot be kicked down the road. It cannot be kicked down the road, at least in western Kansas. And I look forward to answering any questions that you might have. And again, thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I would say that if there were a Colorado producer here, they'd be talking about their children and grandchildren as well. So I appreciate your focus there. Dr. Herbert, you have the last word, and then we'll go to questions.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me today. I'm Dr. Ellen Herbert, Senior Scientist for Ducks Unlimited, North America's leader in voluntary incentive-based wetland and grassland conservation. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of Ducks Unlimited regarding the Western water crisis. Water is at the center of what we do as an organization. Western states have lost between 20 and 90% of their original wetlands through direct drainage and conversion of wetlands. Others have been lost through the diversion of source water for other uses. It will come to no surprise that drought is further exacerbating wetland loss. This has had a profound effect on water birds and other wetland-dependent wildlife, as well as the important ecological functions wetlands provide to people by capturing floodwater, augmenting river flows, recharging deep aquifers, and regulating climate. The drought situation is dire. However, when I can, I want to offer solutions on the role of Farm Bill programs and other programs like the National Wetlands Conservation Act. Wetland restoration in states like Colorado and Kansas can be part of the drought mitigation solution. We have heard from other witnesses about flow retiming. Wetlands with subsurface connectivity tend to regulate hydrology by capturing water during snowmelt or flood periods and direct that water through shallow subsurface flows, providing a constant subsurface discharge to streams and rivers during drought periods. DU and other multiple partners in public and private entities deliver the South Platte River wetland augmentation wetlands in Colorado to direct water to wetland ponds during high flow. These projects offset agricultural well depletion, supplement base flow during dry periods, and provide habitat for waterfowl, wading birds, cranes, and other threatened and endangered species. Wetlands can also play a role in recharging deep aquifers. DU works with USDA through the SAFE program and other partners in the southern high plains to restore playa wetlands. As the ranking member knows too well, the Ogallala aquifer is being depleted at an alarming rate. But scientists estimate that aquifer recharge rates in playa wetlands are 10 to 1,000 times higher than recharge rates in upland systems, and playa wetlands contribute up to 95% of the aquifer recharge. By restoring functional playas, we can improve water security for future generations and provide important migratory bird habitat. These playas, among other CRP wetlands, are also the subject of a newly funded USDA project led by DU and partners from USGS, ARS, and 6 state and tribal universities examining the climate mitigation potential of the CRP program. Previous research indicates these wetlands and surrounding grasslands are important carbon reservoirs. Water efficiency is another important component of drought resilience, especially in arid western states where it can be difficult to supply enough water to support a significant human population, globally important agriculture industry, and vital habitat for waterfowl and other wildlife. The Klamath Basin irrigation project, for instance, supports tens of thousands of wetland acres and hundreds of thousands of acres of cropland, requiring 440,000 acre-feet of water annually. This year is slated to receive only 50,000 acres, or 11% of that demand. Lower Klamath and Tule Lake National Wildlife Refuge, once the most important waterfowl refuges in North America, will receive no water and be completely dry. In a typical winter, the Central Valley of California hosts between 6 and 8 million ducks and geese, which rely on wetlands and winter-flooded rice. This year, rice planting will be around half of what it normally is. Rice is an important commodity and provides more than half of all waterfowl food in the Central Valley. The rest of the wetlands of the Central Valley of California are slated to get 20% of or less than normal water supplies. While there is no single solution other than increased snowpack and more rain, which is becoming increasingly unlikely with changing weather patterns and warmer winters, we can implement more water-efficient practices to better use what we have. To meet water demands in California, water is delivered to users through an elaborate system of water storage and conveyance infrastructure, but these systems are often inefficient. Working with multiple partners on 2 projects, Gray Lodge and Llano Seco Water Supply, DU is pursuing design and construction projects to replace leaky and inefficient siphons and canals. These projects will create nearly 47,000 acre-feet of new and improved water conveyance capacity and provide reliable water delivery to 29,000 acres of agricultural land and 9,000 acres of wetland. As drought continues to worsen, we want to ensure our policies are maximizing water resilience, water reuse, and water efficiency to minimize conflict between water users. Working with public and private partners, including the USDA, Ducks Unlimited will continue to advocate and implement multi-benefit water projects to maintain vital habitat and support human use. Thank you, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Herbert. I'd like to thank the witnesses for your substantive and sober testimony and for coming in at 5 minutes. We really appreciate that. And I'd say to the senators, we're now going to turn to a round of 5-minute questions for each of us. And I'm going to start, Mr. Mueller, with you and ask you, assuming we move forward as we are now with no changes to our water use and no meaningful action to slow climate change, can you describe what you think the Colorado River Basin will look like in 20 years or 40 years? Could you give the committee also a little bit of a sense about what is happening in Lake Powell and Lake Mead as well?
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator. I would say 20 or 30 years from now, the Colorado River Basin will be a starkly different place if we don't act quickly and act intelligently. All of the scientific consensus is clear that we are facing a situation where we can expect additional cuts to the flow of the Colorado River as great as 30%. So a 50% reduction from 20 years ago. This is in a river system that, again, is already over-appropriated and overused. What that means is that we will have great conflict between our growing cities in the river basin and our national food supply. It means that the price and value of water will exceed the current value of agricultural production water, and it is likely that our agriculture in the Colorado River Basin will be greatly diminished. It is a situation that is dire, frankly. I talk about our family farms and ranches in western Colorado, but the reality is our farmers throughout the Colorado River Basin feed America. You look to the lower basin, and any of us who have enjoyed a salad in the winter, it's coming from Yuma, Arizona, or in the Imperial Irrigation District. It's watered with Colorado River water. We simply cannot see that disappear over the next 30 years. Today, that massive system of reservoirs that I referred to has the 2 largest. That's the Lake Mead at Hoover Dam and Lake Powell with the Glen Canyon Dam. You may have read in the paper that the states and the Department of Interior very cooperatively this year enacted some extremely shocking emergency actions and did so in the space of about 2 weeks of dialogue. We're talking about a water bureaucracy that moves at the pace of melting glaciers 200 years ago, not in today's pace. And they came together because what the reality is that Lake Powell was predicted to drop below minimum power production at the lake. And that's bad enough because the western United States depends upon that cheap power coming out of the crisp reservoirs. But it's even worse when you look at the infrastructure issue associated with that. That leaves us with 2 outlets out of Glen Canyon Dam. The concern at the Bureau of Reclamation was that those 2 river bypass outlets would actually cavitate like they did in the 1980s and erode the concrete tunnels that pass that water because they appear not to be functioning as they were designed in the early 1960s. The concern was that we would not be able to pass water to the lower basin at all. No water in the Grand Canyon, no water for California, no water for Nevada. And that is a stark warning to all of us. We were within months of hitting that level in Lake Powell. So we moved water around, didn't release as much out of Glen Canyon down through the Grand Canyon this year, about 500,000 acre-feet. And we also moved another 500,000 acre-feet from Flaming Gorge Reservoir up in Wyoming and Utah down into Lake Powell. These are one-time fixes. These are one moment in time. We don't have any more of those IV bags, as I call them, our upper basin reservoirs. The three reservoirs that the federal government controlled that sit above Lake Powell sit at approximately 23, 27, and somewhere around 50% full, respectively. They are stark and empty. This year's snowpack, as we sit here today, has melted a full month earlier than the average runoff. Our runoff peaked at about 60% of average runoff. As I referenced in my written testimony last year, we had about an 89% snowpack in the Colorado River Basin. Pretty good, close to average. Well, the inflow into Lake Powell, where it really matters, was less than 37%. So the change and the heat is just killing this river. And so I would just say that we need to act. We need to act in a way that supports our agricultural community. And I think that the federal government and through the Department of Agriculture has a tremendous ability to do that with our producers hand in hand.
Thank you. Mr. Mueller, I'm going to reserve my other questions till my colleagues have a chance to ask theirs. So, Senator Marshall?
I'm going to yield my time to Senator Tuberville, and I'll come back. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here today. Very interesting. I'm from Alabama. We got a lot of water. We don't have this problem, but I spent a lot of time out west, and I'm a big hunter, duck hunter. I understand your problem, and it is a huge problem. I've been on Lake Powell several times. What a mess. My question is, we know we got a problem. Why do we have a problem? I mean, we got to figure out the problem before we can get a solution. Is it governors? Is it we're sending too much water to the cities? I know Dallas and Fort Worth are draining the aquifer in North Texas. They're sending millions of gallons a day. So why are we in this situation? Who wants to take it first? Dr. Mueller, Mr. Mueller, you start. Anybody else want to answer this? Why do we have this? Well, I hear climate change. I'm fine with climate change, but why? How do we stop this?
I might take the first crack at that. I would say twofold. First, the majority of the western states fall under what's called the prior appropriation doctrine, and individual water rights are private property rights dedicated and owned by the owner of the property. A lot of times that development happened clear back as in the 1800s and certainly by 1970, 1980. We really didn't have adequate data at that point to have a good handle on what the situation was going to be. So that's part of it is just lack of understanding at the time we were allocating the water supply and water rights. The second is that as we think about it from the standpoint of making those decisions, we're using the best available data that's available to us at that point. Our history, you've heard the chairman talk about the fact that the West is as dry as it's been for 1,200 years. Well, we don't have 1,200 years worth of record to make decisions on. At that point, we had 50 to maybe 100 years of record, and I think if we look at the overall history of the record, we allocated a lot of that water supply during a fairly wet period. And so we consequently, in a lot of cases, over-allocated the resource and did that in a private property rights situation. We certainly want to respect those private property rights, but it puts us in a situation of how do we manage a more limited situation than we thought we had at the time those water rights were issued. And I think, it has been pointed out that the question of, is it urban versus ag? I think we're all in this together, whether it's ag or urban, industry,
It's
environment.
going to take both.
It's going to take all of us working together to resolve this.
Yeah. So we have this problem, and you look at it and say, the climate is changing, which it obviously moves back and forth. But, is it because we're concentrating more people in one area that they're stopping the water from coming down south? He's the end of the food chain here in South Arizona. So, we got to figure out the problem. We can't just throw money at something that's not going to help. Anybody else want to answer this? Where do we start?
I'll give you a little more time because I just think it's such a fundamentally good question, Senator Tuberville. Thank you. Dr. Schultz, did you want to take?
Yeah, thank
Crack at
you. Thanks for the question, Senator Tuberville. I can mostly speak to the research on forest fires. That's my area of expertise, but I can say that we're seeing a lot of data that indicates because of anthropogenic climate change, human-caused climate change, we're seeing significant increases in temperatures, which is leading to rain that's not falling as snow anymore. So we have different timing of flows, water that's evaporating. We're looking at potential low to no snow futures in
Why
just
is
a
it doing
few.
that, though? Why are we
Because
having?
it's getting hotter primarily, and then we're having changes in precipitation patterns. So for example, there's these predictions that we'll see much more intensive flooding after fires because these atmospheric rivers will come in and we'll have more extreme rainfall in the summertime than we've ever seen before. And so it's the increased temperature is leading to changes in how and when water is coming, and then changes in precipitation patterns. If we look at patterns for forest fires, for a while we were talking about the fact that past fire suppression in our fire-prone forests was a big reason we were seeing more fires. But now we're seeing that climate change effects, and this is when I talk to my fire scientist colleagues, they're saying climate change and increased heat, it's leading to higher temperatures, different relative humidity, wind speeds, and increased fire behavior in ways that we've never seen before. So a paper just came out that said there were 3 times the amount of fire in our high elevation forests than ever has been seen on the record. So I think to a large extent we can think about how we can adapt to climate change. How do we live with it? What do we do for our forests in the meantime? But fundamentally, we have to reduce carbon emissions and slow climate change. That's ultimately where the solution lies.
Thank you.
Senator Marshall?
Okay, thank you again. I think I'll start with Mr. Lewis on the same topic of managing flood events. I think, it sure seems like we're having more flood events. How can we manage that water from rivers that are flooding and store them better? We've talked about this in Kansas for decades. How do we take advantage of that situation? Any thoughts?
Well, I think as we look at the situation, at least in our part of the world, the central United States, what the forecast or the long-term models would say is that we'll get roughly the same amount of precipitation, but in more intense events and maybe in more time in between the events. And really what that means, if you're going to manage the water, we kind of have to go back to where we're at maybe in the middle part of the last century with storage. As was just mentioned, we may see much more intense rainfall, and that can lead to more flooding if we don't have the infrastructure in order to capture that, and then ideally put that to use once the flood passes us.
Are you seeing anybody being successful this? It seems like the Corps just wants to build dikes higher and higher, and I keep thinking about natural spillways and ways to manage those flood waters.
There are a few examples, certainly as we see more and more demand primarily from our cities and urban centers for water. We are seeing, certainly in Texas and California, in North Texas, there was recently a reservoir that was permitted and is being built called Lower Bodark, which is about 13,000 surface acres. That's probably the largest reservoir of its kind being built in the United States at this point. That had to be done by the local water supply district. The federal government and most of the state governments are not really in the business of building storage and managing that type of infrastructure at this point.
Okay. My next question is kind of a generic one that we'll see if we have time for everybody to answer. I want to know in the federal government conservation programs, Tom, and I'll come to you first, what's working for water conservation, what's not working? How would you improve water conservation if you were king, if you were writing the next farm bill? What would that look like to you to give you more flexibility?
First of all, yeah, flexibility is the key to it. Maybe shorter term type programs. The key to getting, in my opinion, in production agriculture is to be able to incentivize the producer to try new technologies without feeling like he's going to lose his farm if things don't work. Because we're an aging population in production agriculture. And so that willingness to step out of the box and say, hey, I want to switch the way that I'm doing things, that's hard. That can be a very hard decision, especially, again, with overall farm income, net farm income projected to be down. So what would I do with them? I think I would mirror a little bit like we do in Kansas, where we say, hey, I go to them, I'd like to put in some probes, I'd like to do this. There's some incentives for me to try that, but then they don't tell me what I have to do from there. They look at the results. I tell them what I want to do. In my case, I said I will reduce my water usage by 50%.
Okay.
And we were able to do that, and we were able to hold net income at the same level. But I think that would be my one suggestion.
Mr. Lewis, kind of expand upon that. What have you seen working from the federal level? Obviously, the state's giving them some flexibility, your control. If you were to help us direct the next Farm Bill dollars, what can we do to give you more flexibility or to make this work for your people, our people?
Well, I think Mr. Willis hit on it pretty well, frankly. Much of the programs that are dedicated to this type of activity really weren't built for irrigation efficiency or water management. They were primarily built coming out of the 30s and the 50s with dust bowls, and they were focused on soil conservation and those kind of things. Very laudable goals and very important activity. They're really difficult to then take those same programs and then apply them to the type of things that Tom just talked about. I think some more focus on irrigation technology, on water management, maybe dedicating some of the resource and some of the programs towards that would be helpful in trying to move us in the right direction from the federal side.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Yeah, if I could just add, Senator Marshall, I appreciate that question. I would say there are a couple things real quickly. In our district, we deal with both the NRCS and the Bureau of Reclamation in the far west. And the problem we have is that the two agencies have completely different NEPA compliance processes. We have projects where we combine the money from the two agencies together with state and local money, and we end up spending years doing extra NEPA compliance because we end up having to comply with the Bureau policies and then the NRCS policies. We would love to see a farm bill that directs the NRCS to be able to use the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation NEPA compliance program and policy. So if we do that first, we can move forward with both agencies. It would be tremendously helpful. The only other thing I would say is that we are looking at these huge increases in prices on piping in particular. That's one of our best way to increase water efficiency and water conservation on off-farm delivery. The process that the NRCS uses through EQIP oftentimes combines both the design and the construction in one contract. And so by the time we get the design approved, we get the contract approved, the construction prices have escalated recently as much as 100%. And the original contract price cannot cover the on-farm and off-farm delivery systems. We would ask that you consider supporting and reestablishing the index payment rate program within the NRCS and authorizing the NRCS to break those two phases of contracting up so that when we finally contract for construction, it is a realistic number and not one that is futile. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. Thank you for that testimony. Senator Lujan's actually next in order, but he has kindly said, Senator Braun, if you'd like to go since you were here, and thank you for coming, that you can go next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually live on a farm and have practiced conservation my entire life. watch with horror sometimes when I see what's happening, especially in the far west, to where it looks like agriculture is a long-term enterprise, and your main asset is your land and your water table. And when that starts going the wrong direction, I don't know how you strategically make the decisions of what you're going to do long-term. Most other businesses don't have that dynamic in play. So I'd like Mr. Mueller and Mr. Lewis to give me an idea, especially in maybe the near west. Are you in as bad a shape or impending as what we see through places like California, where I don't know how owning a farm there would look like you could say that's a long-term enterprise, you know, when you literally could run out of water. How far east is that situation for all of us to be concerned about in terms of what the future holds?
Well, Senator Braun, maybe I can take that, and then we can move further east to Kansas. I would tell you that our farmers in the high mountains of Colorado, our ranchers and farmers, deal with drought. They're used to dealing with drought on a fairly regular basis. Many of our ditches are direct supply ditches. We don't have the benefit of groundwater in our area. We're very heavily relying on surface water, snow runoff. Our farmers understand, and our ranchers understand, that when they look up at the mountains and they see a dry year, they're used to saying, well, that back 40 that's not as productive, I'm going to fallow it. I'm going to not irrigate that so that I can get the maximum bang out of my most productive fertile soils. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 22 years of this severe drought in Colorado. I'd say that we're just as bad off as California. We just maybe don't have as many people demanding it, but we are incredibly dry. I think that developing a program where we assist farmers on a programmatic scale to remove that marginal ag. And I would also say, you know, we have an awful lot of people who've moved into Colorado, just as in California, and getting some of our, what my real agricultural constituents would call hobby farmers, getting them to dry up their views in favor of food production with a little federal incentive would truly help us. So targeting those two areas in voluntary conservation programs would be tremendously helpful.
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And I would say that it probably runs right through the middle of Kansas and Oklahoma, Texas, clear up to North Dakota. We often talk from a water standpoint about, at least in Kansas, it being two states, from a very semi-arid in the western part of the state, groundwater dominated, to much more rainfall, up to 45 inches in the eastern part of our state.
How much in the eastern part?
Up to 45 inches. We're at about 15 or 16 in the southwest portion, and about 45, so about three times
about
difference.
Indiana rainfall then.
That's right. And so, you know, the western third of our state, we are really in a water mining situation at this point. We have groundwater level declines, and it's like any real estate, it's about location. We've got some areas that are effectively dewatered. We've got other areas that are 25 or 50 years left. We've got areas close to the Oklahoma border that may have 200 years left. And so, you know, I think that making sure that we tailor whatever action we take to that individual area, that individual producer, is key to our long-term success. One thing that hasn't been hit on yet that I think is key is, and Mr. Willis talked about it just briefly, is crop varieties and crop genetics. We are seeing, even in the western part of our state, because of drought-tolerant crops, people that can be successful in certainly in a normal year, where 25 to 50 years ago that wasn't the case on a dry land situation. I think additional research dedicated to crop genetics that are more suited to the high plains would certainly make sure that we can keep those farmers viable for the long term.
Thank you. Dr. Schultz, I've been a tree farmer since the late 80s, and all I can tell you is it's great therapy for this current job. I go back to it every weekend. Forest ground has a little different dynamic. It's a longer horizon. The biggest thing I deal with would be invasive species, and we've got one called stiltgrass that once it gets into your woods, you don't even know that it's not native, and you do a poor harvest, and it's gone from your skid trails into enveloping the entire woods, and you can't even get a seedling that'll break through. And I know that you've got similar stuff in the west, cheatgrass, other stuff that you contend with. How big a deal is that, and how much has that become a problem in the recent past?
Yes, thank you, Senator Braun, for the question. My understanding, and I'll just caveat to say that that's a little bit outside of my expertise, but my understanding is that there'll be insect and disease outbreaks in our forests in the West, and they will have a variety of effects. So sometimes it'll mean that you'll get 2 cycles of insects in a year because it's warmer instead of 1, or you'll have situations where because you don't get a hard freeze, the larvae don't die, so that'll exacerbate it. But I think part of what happened when we saw a massive die-off in California a few years ago was that there was an insect outbreak and it weakened the trees and stressed them. And then in addition to the drought and heat conditions, it caused a huge mortality event. And then that can interact with fire in some tricky ways as well.
Well, very good. I think whenever something becomes weak or the climate's not in sync, you now have that issue, less for row crop farming, but a big deal for forest management. Thank you.
Senator Braun, I really appreciate those questions. We've had terrible beetle kill in Colorado that, and it's happening at the headwaters. So when the forest dies, this basically is our water infrastructure for the Rocky Mountain West. So I really appreciate your line of questioning. Senator Lujan, my neighbor, is here, and I think you're going to go next, and then Senator Hoeven. In your absence, Mr. Lewis from Kansas mentioned his support of your bill with Senator Heinrich, the Water Data Act. So I just want you to know you were mentioned while you weren't here.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Bennett.
Thank you.
Thanks for holding this hearing with you and Mr. Marshall as well. And Mr. Lewis, that's encouraging that you are supportive of that effort. We have an incredible U.S. House member by the name of Melanie Stansberry. She used to work over here in the Senate, and the good people of New Mexico saw that expertise, and now she's in the House. But she really was the brain trust behind some of this with the work she did on similar issues in the Senate. So I appreciate that. And across the West, I'm glad to hear across the country right now there's more and more attention to the drought conditions that we're all experiencing. I myself, I'm 4th generation on a small farm. Now, some people may refer to what we do on a few acres as hobby farming. To us, it's self-sustenance. And while we eat what comes out of that ground, so do animals. So whether it's sheep or cattle or others that may be grazing on hay or that alfalfa that we're baling, it's all important as well. And as we're looking at those impacts, and Dr. Schultz, in New Mexico, like in Colorado, and I think Mr. Mueller mentioned this as well, our water comes from those watersheds, from snowmelt, from accumulation. And like southern Colorado and New Mexico, they're all irrigation ditchways. And some people, may chuckle at what we do, but centuries ago, our ancestors saw right to dig 3 feet across, 3 feet down, and then they put these head gates. We call them compuertas. It's the Spanish name for a door, but head gate. And then we manage the water flow. In good years, everyone has more crop production, and in bad years, everyone's fighting. And you always have to walk up that ditch, and oftentimes it's with a shovel in your hand because you go look to see who took your water, and you have words with one another. But then the water gets flowing again. So it's always positive that way. But whether it's centuries old or we look at irrigation structures that have been constructed in conjunction with the United States of America within USDA, private entities that have taken these over and doing that work, it's also important. And last week I was visiting some areas of New Mexico where we have the largest fire on record now. It was started by a prescribed burn by the Forest Service within the USDA. But nonetheless, I'm very concerned about what dry conditions mean and lower water yields on the front end, and what that sometimes can lead to with beetles and other invasive species. But I'm much more concerned, at least during this time in New Mexico, with what good water is going to mean for us. Good water is going to mean bad water conditions, because that fire burned so hot. We've got ash 6 to 12 inches deep. We have trees that are going to come down. They're going to clog up the rivers. That ash is going to go into waterways and culverts. And some of these towns, that 90% of the water that is for drinking water in these communities, they're not able to touch it. And so Dr. Schultz, can you touch on that a little bit as well with, fire and water, good conditions before or bad conditions, what that means too, and then on the back end, what that could yield to, and how we need to be thoughtful about conditions before and conditions after what could be caused with the fire?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Lujan, for that question. And I'm certainly very cognizant of the intense fires you're facing in your state right now. And, my heart goes out to your state and people who are dealing with that. And it's going to be an issue for a long time to come. I mean, I live in the footprint of the Cameron Peak fire, which I think was the largest fire in state history in Colorado. And it's had an enormous impact on our watershed. And I've watched that myself because the ash and water flows are very obviously impacted post-fire. And so I think one of the things we should think about is how we can improve our post-fire recovery funding and strategies. And I think that would be an area for emphasis for the Farm Bill, and something that we're going to be working on this summer is trying to understand specifically what people are needing and where they're running into challenges so we can help inform this committee on those issues. The other thing that I understand is that a lot of communities don't have backup water supplies. And so sometimes they have to, we have seen some communities where they switch to a backup water supply, but other communities are not going to have that option. And they're just one fire away from having their water supply essentially shut down. And we've also seen tremendous impacts to water infrastructure. So for example, I think after the Hayman fire in Colorado, estimates were that the impacts to water supplies for cities around Denver were over $30 million because of those sediment flows into the water infrastructure. So there's the impacts of the debris actually into the system, the toxicity of the water, and then the impacts to the infrastructure itself, which can be hugely important to clean up. So I think that all leads to the need to do more to limit these kinds of catastrophic fires, and also just recognize that they are going to be a bigger part of our future, and we're going to have to figure out how to have some nimbleness with our water infrastructure, with our water supply, and also have more focus on our post-fire recovery for communities.
Appreciate that, Dr. Schultz. And Mr. Chairman, since my time is out, there's two other issues that I wanted to raise, but it's more to get the attention of the committee staff as well as we're all working in these areas as well. And it carries off from what Mr. Braun was talking about with the invasive species with plants and weeds and things of that nature. In New Mexico and in southern Colorado, it's salt cedar in our waterways, and then we have these elms that, if we could just figure out how to get fruit growing out of them, we'd solve a lot of challenges. But these things spout up like crazy, and they drink a ton of water. But especially these smaller communities, they don't have the financial means to take those things down. It gets expensive. So to the extent that as we're looking at conservation and drought mitigation, that we try to plus that up, and that we look at smaller areas maybe where those local governments don't have the means to be able to get that done. And then the last thing that I'll say on conservation is, well, we need to be doing more in these specific areas with some of these earthen waterways, like Mr. Mueller just talked about. That's what recharges wells and keeps good trees from falling, that everyone's growing out that way as well. So as we find that balance, as we're working with lining and things of that nature, but that we understand those ecosystems that exist, or drinking water in many of these communities, which would turn into ghost towns if they didn't have water and there's no other way to get it to them. So just so that we're thinking about both of those. And I thanks everyone for the time, and thanks for the hearing, Mr. Chairman.
And I also want to say how sorry I am for the fires that are occurring in New Mexico. We know it's just a matter of time when it's happening again in Colorado, and it's gotten to the point, I mean, we do need to write a farm bill for the 21st century that understands what we're dealing with. One of these fires that we had 2 years ago in Colorado fell, and then it snowed before anybody could do any work on the landscape. That's what happens when you got a world where you're all of a sudden there's no fire season anymore, and that's what we're dealing with. So thank you. Senator Hoeven, thank you so much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks for holding, to you and the ranking member for holding the hearing, and it's always good to follow Ray-Ban. He's one of my favorites. If, picking up on what the chairman just said, though, and I'd ask this to each one of you, if there's one thing in the Farm Bill that you think we should make sure that we've got there to help with drought, what is it? First, there are going to be a number of things, but, priority one, what is it?
I would say that funds in the Farm Bill to assist with both post-fire recovery and both natural and man-made infrastructure in the high country of our watersheds is what we truly need.
So is there something now that is targeted to that you think is effective that we would build on?
There are programs, for instance, the EQIP program.
We use EQIP a lot.
Yeah, and it's well suited. I spoke just a little bit earlier on this that we've been running into some really tremendous issues where people who have approved for and contracted under EQIP are unable to actually complete the projects because of the inflation that we're seeing on piping. Really a problem because I think everybody at the federal government and our local partners are really trying to make these things work, and spreading that limited water out is absolutely essential during these times.
Yeah, no, I really like that answer because EQIP is, and for a lot of other purposes too, our producers really like it. So I think that's right on the money, literally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I would echo a lot of that comment as well. I think EQIP, making sure it has adequate funding and also has flexibility. Again, the situation all across the West and all across the nation varies greatly. But being able, in our situation, to be able to target those funds towards things that are more irrigation technology or things that are going to save us water, make us more resilient, I think is key.
EQIP funding and flexibility, I absolutely agree with both of you. Doctor?
Thank you, Senator. In addition, I was going to ask for permission to say two things, but these gentlemen covered it for one of mine, which is great. I wanted to also bring attention to some of the work we're doing with the USDA Climate Hub. So these hubs are really dedicated to working with agricultural and forest users across the region to do things like drought planning or forecasting of conditions. And I've been realizing that the universities could bring a lot to that partnership, and it's already a partnership that's in place. We're working on bringing our extension capacity to work on drought planning with the climate hubs. We're working on then integrating that into training the next generation workforce. We bring some of our research expertise on how to communicate effectively. And I think there might be potential to build that kind of thing out. You know, we see these multi-year partnerships with USGS and universities in the climate adaptation science centers. And I'm wondering if we need something similar on the ag and forestry side of things in partnership with USDA and leveraging the capacity of the universities as well.
Okay. Mr. Willis?
Thank you, Senator. I would say as a producer, the key is flexibility. And I say that in terms of getting people to adopt, producers now, to adopt technology. Sometimes you have to start small. Maybe it's a circle, maybe it's two. It's having that flexibility so they can try it and see that it works. Because we face so many risks. Nobody wants another risk, and nobody wants another program that's inflexible or has a ton of reporting that needs to go with it. But if we're truly serious, and I'm speaking about Western Kansas, okay, and Eastern, well, Senator Bennett, I guess I'm going to speak for Eastern Colorado too.
Please do.
From a production perspective, it's having that ability to go in and say, try this. Try it on two circles. Had somebody come to me 20 years ago and said you could cut your water usage in half and still keep your bottom line the same, I would have laughed at them. But I tried it. But I'm unique because I have a few other businesses. So if something didn't go quite right, it wasn't like I was going to absolutely lose the family farm. A lot of them don't have that.
You didn't have to bet the farm, so to speak.
What?
You didn't have to bet the farm on trying something.
No. So by doing that and having that in there and saying, hey, come and try it. And when I'm talking about flexibility too, it's saying we'll have different programs. You want to cut water by 10%? Here's a program. You want to get real aggressive? Here's a program. Mm-hmm. You will, in my opinion, you will get a lot better participation, a lot better adaptation because they'll see that it works and they'll see that they're not going to lose their farm and they're not going to get bogged down with a lot of the inflexibility, I guess, that we've seen.
So, Doctor, is it pronounced Herbert or Hebert? It is Herbert. Okay. The northern pronunciation then, huh?
The northern pronunciation.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, but I just want to kind of preface your response on this too with Mr. Willis said a couple things really important. One, the program should fit the producer, the farmer or the rancher. You shouldn't make the farmer or the rancher fit the program, right? And a lot of folks think, yeah, the farmer or the rancher needs to fit the program, but the program should fit. And so when we talk about flexibility, I think Mr. Willis said it awfully well. I call it, the programs have to be farmer friendly. And it really is my opinion, and I love to hunt and fish. My wife's a much better fisher person than I am, but I think conservation is a really benefit when they have that mindset of farmer-friendly programs, because they're the ones that they're the ones that are out on the land. They own the land. They live and work there every day. So they don't own public lands, but they're out there even on public lands, like in the forest, the grasslands in our case, but in the forest and so forth. So anyway, kind of respond with that thought in mind, right? If you would.
Yeah, and you've set me up perfectly. I agree with everything that's been said, particularly EQIP. One of the programs that has worked really well for us is the RCPP and the RCPP Alternative Funding Agreement that allows us to do exactly what you're saying. Our soil health and livestock integration program in the Dakotas relies on starting with interviews with ranchers and producers about what will work for them, and allows us to be very flexible to design our contracting around what works for them. And so that RCPP and the AFA program have opened the doors for that. They're also opening the doors. Everything that's been talked about is wonderful, but to execute it, you need people in the field interacting with producers. And again, the RCPP program has allowed us to get much more technical assistance out in the field, talking to producers about what they need and designing programs to fit that need. And so I can't say enough about the ability of that particular program to expand NRCS's reach through public-private partnerships and meet farmers where they are, because designing those programs around those production systems is critical to the longevity of those programs. And I'll add one more thing, which is we have made a significant effort to research and collect data from producers on the financial and other natural resource benefits they see from conservation practices. And we have the data that says if those practices are financially viable, producers will continue to do them after the contract expires. But that requires data to show the producer, and that requires us to collect data and fund the collection of data.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hoban. Fantastic questions. Senator Marshall, do you have any?
I got maybe one more question, Senator Bennett. I just want to again thank you for holding the hearing. This one has been one of the more informative hearings we've had. A great panel. This is why I came to the Senate.
Yeah,
was to solve problems like this, to solve water conservation issues, to leave this world cleaner, healthier, and safer than we found it, to make sure that future generations have water. I talked about farmers and ranchers being the original conservationists. Remember my grandfathers building terraces in the 1960s for soil conservation, and now it's our generation's turn to take those next steps as well. So I appreciate the input today. I want to close just with one question for Dr. Herbert. The reason my wife and I support Ducks Unlimited is because you do a great job taking government dollars, the dollars you raise, and then you work with local farmers, local ranchers, and then you make sure those dollars are spent very efficiently. You spend it like it's your own money, and we appreciate that. Coming back to my original question for everybody that you didn't get to answer, and you've alluded to it in parts of it, what hasn't worked? What are we throwing away money on? And then what would you accentuate? All these ideas are great ideas. Our challenge is how to prioritize the finite dollars that we have, and what we spend, we want this to be spent very efficiently.
Yeah, and this has been said by multiple other folks, from producers to the scientists, but there's a very fine balance between collecting data to demonstrate what works and what does not work, and I mean both biophysical data on weather and fires and water use efficiency, and financial data on how these interact with our producers and production systems and return on investment. So there's a very fine balance there. For us, as I said earlier, the flexibility of some programs like RCPP, which does, again, allow us to leverage public and private dollars against Farm Bill dollars, has been extremely important for experimenting with new types of practices.
Can you tell us, describe a project that you're excited about that's really worked? What does that look like?
Yeah, so our interaction with our Rice Stewardship Partnership is a great example where we have, I believe, close to $100 million in RCPP funds that are leveraged against other funds. We have worked with various industry partners and agribusiness to develop new technologies like polypipe that reduce water use and increase efficiency. It's a really exciting partnership because it's bringing together data on things like water efficiency and water quality, and bringing those together with data on production and the sustenance of waterfowl across multiple flyways. And I think that really exciting partnership was born out of the flexibility of the RCPP program and our ability to get almost 20 staff out in the field to talk to producers. And that's, to me, the most exciting thing about some of these programs is it starts with the landowner.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Senator Marshall. I just have a couple quick questions. One for you, Dr. Herbert. First, I completely agree with everything you said about RCPP. I think that is an example of flexibility. It's outcomes-based and it's partnership-driven. And given the data that, we all now can collect, since this is not the 19th century anymore, being able to measure to those kind of outcomes could be really important and create, a real opportunity for us to move the Farm Bill forward in a way that would be useful to all of us. I just wonder before you leave whether because Ducks Unlimited is so cherished on both sides of the aisle here, if you could talk a little bit about what the effect of this persistent drought is having on bird populations in the United States.
Thank you for that question, Senator. And I will start with a caveat that I'm a water scientist, not a waterfowl scientist, but I've spent many years with my colleagues discussing these issues. Unfortunately, this current drought has come at a confluence with the COVID pandemic, and that has really limited our ability to collect data on water and waterfowl and other migratory birds. But if we look back to other persistent droughts, such as the 2011-2015 drought, we saw a drop in the Central Valley of California, about half the breeding population in that flyway. As I mentioned before, we're looking at the Klamath Basin, which once provided 25,000 acres of wetland. As of last fall, there were 600 acres of wetland. And that's contributed to a botulism outbreak that it's killed 50,000 birds. You're concentrating them and the water exchange just isn't there. And then we know we're just now, at least in the eastern part of the northern Great Plains, the Prairie Pothole region, the duck factory, we're coming out of a 2-year drought. I was just in the prairies and things look much better than they did 2 years ago. But we know that at least in North Dakota, populations declined 25% just over that 2-year drought cycle. So the implications are profound for not just waterfowl, but migratory birds that depend on these resources. I believe the Fish and Wildlife Service statistic is that 40% of all wildlife depend on wetlands for some portion of their life cycle. So these droughts do have a pretty profound impact on not just waterfowl, but many, many species of wildlife that are economically and culturally important to us.
Thank you, Dr. Herbert. And Dr. Schultz, I'm going to ask my last question of you, going to the question of accountability and priorities that Senator Marshall raised. What would you like to see out of the money that's in the infrastructure bill that, is going to forestry? That I think of that as a good down payment. I mean, we have a much greater need than that, but still, how would you like to see that money spent so that we're doing it well? And could you sort of reinforce what you think the unmet need is in terms of forestry in the West?
Thank you for that question, Senator Bennett. I certainly think that the estimates from the Forest Service and from partners, like I mentioned, were 40 to 60 billion over the next 10 years to really make a dent in reducing risk to communities and also protecting watersheds. And so I think there is a huge still unmet need to address that in investments in our forests. And then there's going to be a long-term need to really maintain our forests. Once we invest in reducing those fuels, we then have to maintain those conditions to get our return on investment. And that's going to mean, putting prescribed fire on those lands to keep fuel loads lower. It's going to mean ongoing thinning and work in those areas near communities and watersheds. So I think that's something that we need to think as a nation as a long-term investment in our fire-adapted forests if we really want to maintain them for water supply and for carbon storage. When we're thinking about where to invest, I think that the 10-year strategy that the Forest Service has issued makes a lot of sense in terms of investing near communities and in priority watersheds in our dry, fire-prone forests. That's where we really want to focus investments. There are a few other things that can guide those investments over the next few years. We know that regions and states in their state forest action planning processes have identified a lot of priorities. A lot of that was done under this banner of shared stewardship over the last several years. And so looking to states and local people to say, where are your true priorities and where do you have community-based capacity to implement them? That's going to be really important. So thinking about, I think we want to think about this in two ways. One, where do we want to invest in terms of the forests and the ecology, but also where do we want to invest in really changing our fire culture and really creating communities that are fire adapted. And so where do we want to invest in the people and places that are ready to do that? The work takes a lot of capacity from community-based partners. So we want to start where we have collaborative history and partnerships in place. Things like CFLRP and the Joint Chiefs Program have been working well. And then I think we want to have a more long-term vision of how do we invest in communities and places to build longer-term capacity, maybe places that haven't quite built that collaborative capacity and had investments in the past. We don't want to just keep investing in the same places where they've got it going on, but we want to also build that in other places where we have more underserved communities. So I think, thinking long-term about how we build that capacity to do forestry work, to do prescribed fire, and to do cultural burning, to support tribes in doing cultural burning and in partnership with tribes is going to be really critical in the long run if we're going to maintain those forest ecosystems in the West.
Thank you for that, and thank you to the panel. I think this has been an excellent panel, and I appreciate what you said about why you came to the Senate. This is the point of it. It's supposed to get people that have different points of view, different geographies, different perspectives, and get them in a room and try to hash out solutions. These kind of partnerships that Dr. Schultz were talking about, are what we need, because fire doesn't know any political jurisdiction at all. It can cross from county land to private land to state land to federal land, and they're not making any more water. And nobody's going to be able to solve these problems alone. The producers in this country can't solve it by themselves. The federal government certainly can't solve it by itself. And I hope that today is at the start of being able to help align some of these goals and objectives and partnerships. I certainly look forward to the work we're going to be doing in the next Farm Bill to address what the landscape looks like in the 21st century and what our producers and others need. So thank you for being here today. I'm really grateful, and thank you, Senator Marshall, for being such a tremendous ranking member. And I want to also thank your staff, who did great work with my staff as well. And to the other senators that were here, thanks for showing up. We'd ask that any additional statements or questions you may have for the record be submitted to the committee clerk 5 business days from today, or 5 p.m. next Tuesday, June 14th, 2022. The hearing is adjourned.